My name is Denise Carter, and the day my marriage ended, I told myself the hardest part would be walking away. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing that even after you survive a divorce, you still have to survive the way people punish you for it. Before I begin, if you enjoy cinematic, emotional storytelling that feels real and leaves you thinking long after it ends, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And while you listen, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had someone you loved treat your pain like it was your fault. Because when I showed up at my son's door after my divorce, I expected a little compassion. What I got instead was a couch and a sentence that cut deeper than any courtroom paperwork ever could. My son's name is Mason. He's 31 now, married, steady, responsible, the kind of man people describe as reliable. That used to make me proud. On the day I called him and told him the divorce was final, I thought he would say, "Are you okay?" I thought he would ask what I needed. Instead, there was a pause on the phone, and then he said, "So where are you going to live?" Not "How are you?" Not "I'm sorry." Just logistics. Still, I told myself he was shocked, that he needed time. I told myself he would understand eventually. My marriage to Mason's father, Frank, lasted 28 years. From the outside, it looked stable. Frank had a good job, we lived in a decent house, and we went to family gatherings like a normal couple. But stability is not the same as safety. Frank never hit me. That's what people like to ask first, as if bruises are the only proof of harm. What Frank did was quieter. He criticized everything. The way I spoke, the way I dressed, the way I laughed. He kept money tight even when we had enough, questioned every purchase, and made me feel guilty for needing anything at all. He told me I was lucky he stayed with me. He told me no one else would. Over time, his voice became the one I heard even when he wasn't in the room. I stayed because I had a son, because I had fear, because I had years invested, because I kept thinking if I tried harder, he would soften. He never did. The final straw wasn't dramatic. It was a Wednesday night, Frank sitting at the table scrolling through his phone while I cleaned up dinner. I asked him calmly if he could stop making jokes about me in front of his friends. He didn't look up. He just said, "You're too sensitive. That's why you're exhausting." Exhausting. That word landed like a stamp across my life. Like my feelings were a burden. Like my existence required an apology. That night, I went to the bathroom, stared at myself in the mirror, and realized I had been shrinking for decades. The divorce was not revenge. It was oxygen. When it became final, I didn't have a grand plan. Frank kept the house. I took what I could afford. My savings were thin because I'd spent years patching holes Frank created with control and silence. I found a place quickly, a small apartment across town, but the landlord backed out at the last minute. Another tenant offered more money. Just like that, the floor disappeared. I had a few boxes, a suitcase, and nowhere to sleep. So I called Mason. I hadn't asked my son for help in years. I hated the idea of being a burden. But I told myself this was temporary. 2 weeks, maybe less, until I found another place. Mason sighed on the phone like I had asked him for something unreasonable. "I guess you can stay here for a bit," he said. "But we don't have a spare room." "That's okay," I replied quickly. "I can figure something out." He didn't ask what happened with the apartment. He didn't ask if I was safe. He just said, "Yeah, okay. Come tonight." Mason lived in a townhouse with his wife Kelsey. Kelsey was polite in the way people are polite when they don't want you to get comfortable. She greeted me at the door with a tight smile, eyes flicking to my suitcase, then to Mason as if silently asking how long this would last. The house smelled like cinnamon candles and new furniture. Everything was clean, coordinated, adult. It didn't feel like a place you could fall apart. Mason carried my suitcase inside and pointed toward the living room. "You can sleep on the couch," he said. It wasn't cruel on its own. Lots of people sleep on couches. It was the way he said it. Like he was assigning me a spot, like I was a delivery that needed to be stored. "Thank you," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. I set my bag down carefully and looked around for signs of welcome. There weren't any. No blanket folded for me. No pillow placed out. No space cleared. Just the couch, already covered with decorative pillows like it wasn't meant for a person. Kelsey stood near the kitchen island and said, "We usually go to bed early, so just keep it down, okay?" I nodded. Of course. That first night, I lay on the couch listening to the quiet hum of their home. I could hear them moving upstairs, closing doors, talking softly. I felt like a guest who arrived uninvited, even though my son told me to come. The next morning, I woke up stiff, my neck aching, and made myself small in the kitchen while Kelsey brewed coffee without offering me any. Mason came down, glanced at me, and said, "So what's the plan?" "I'm looking," I said quickly. "I've already called a few places." He nodded as if checking a box. "Good," he said. "Because this can be long." The words hit like a reminder. You are temporary here. That afternoon, Mason came home from work frustrated. He tossed his keys onto the counter and muttered about traffic. Kelsey asked him about dinner plans, and he snapped at her, then softened immediately, apologizing. I watched quietly, recognizing the rhythm of a man who controls the temperature of a room and expects everyone else to adapt. Mason had Frank's impatience, just dressed in a calmer suit. Later that night, I was washing my cup when Mason walked into the living room and saw me folding my blanket. He leaned against the doorway and said, "You know, Mom, I don't get it." I looked up. "Get what?" He sighed. "The divorce. You didn't have to blow up your life. If you wanted comfort, you should have stayed married." The sentence hung in the air, sharp and casual, like he was stating a simple fact. Comfort? Should have stayed married. My hands froze around the blanket. I felt heat rise in my face, not anger, not embarrassment, but a deep, aching disbelief. My own son was telling me that my pain was the price I deserved for leaving. That comfort mattered more than dignity. That survival wasn't a good enough reason to walk away if it made life inconvenient. I swallowed hard. "Mason," I said softly, "you don't know what my marriage was like." He scoffed. "I grew up in that house," he said. "Dad provided. You had a home. You had stability. People would kill for that." Stability. The word hit me like a cruel joke. I stared at him and realized something that made my chest tighten. My son had learned to measure love in terms of appearances, not feelings. He had watched a marriage that looked fine and assumed that meant it was fine. He had never seen the nights I cried silently in the bathroom. The way Frank's words chipped me down. The fear of speaking up. Because I hid it. I protected Mason from it. And now that protection had become a weapon turned back on me. "I'm not asking you to understand everything," I said, voice trembling despite my effort to keep it steady. "I'm asking you to be kind." Mason rolled his eyes like I was being dramatic. "Kindness doesn't pay bills," he said. "You made your choice. Actions have consequences." Then he turned and walked upstairs, leaving me standing in the living room with my blanket in my hands like a child being scolded. That night, I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of a house that did not want me. The words kept replaying. Comfort? Should have stayed married. I realized with a painful clarity that Mason wasn't just judging me. He was punishing me. For disrupting the narrative he was comfortable with. For refusing to play the role of long-suffering wife so his childhood could remain uncomplicated. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The couch beneath me did not feel like help anymore. It felt like a warning. Because if my son could speak to me that way when I was at my lowest, then maybe the place I thought was safe was never safe at all. The days that followed blurred together in a way that made time feel both heavy and meaningless. I learned the rhythms of the house quickly, not because anyone explained them to me, but because I had to. I woke up before Mason and Kelsey so I wouldn't be in the way. I folded my blanket and tucked my pillow behind the couch cushions every morning so the living room could return to looking untouched, as if no one had slept there. I kept my toiletries in a small bag I carried back and forth to the bathroom, afraid of leaving any sign that I existed beyond those few hours at night. When Mason and Kelsey ate breakfast, I waited until they were done to make myself toast, wiping the counter afterward like an apology. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself I was grateful. But gratitude mixed with humiliation turns sour very quickly. Mason rarely spoke to me unless it was about logistics. Did I have interviews lined up? How long did I think this would take? Was I sure I couldn't stay with someone else? Every question carried the same message underneath it. You are a problem we are managing. Kelsey was quieter, but her silence was sharp. She texted Mason instead of speaking in front of me. She rearranged the living room one afternoon, moving a side table closer to the couch so there would be less space, less comfort. It was subtle, but it worked. At night, I lay there staring at the ceiling fan, listening to their muffled conversations upstairs, feeling like I was shrinking into the furniture. Sometimes I would wake up early and sit in my car just to have somewhere to breathe. One afternoon, while Mason was at work, Kelsey sat across from me at the kitchen table with her laptop open and said, "I don't mean this to sound harsh, but we really need to talk about timelines." I nodded slowly. "I understand," I said. She glanced up briefly. "This situation is stressful," she continued. "We're newly married. We need our space." I wanted to tell her I understood stress. I wanted to tell her about 28 years of swallowing words, about waking up every day wondering how to avoid provoking someone's temper, about losing pieces of yourself quietly. Instead, I just said, "I'm doing my best." She smiled tightly and returned to her screen. That night, Mason came home irritated and snapped at me for leaving my shoes by the door. I apologized immediately, even though they weren't in the way. The apology came out of habit, a reflex I thought I had unlearned. Lying there later, I realized something painful. The couch was starting to feel familiar in the same way my marriage once had. Uncomfortable, but survivable. Limiting, but predictable. And that scared me more than being alone. I started looking harder for apartments, calling places farther away, smaller, less ideal. I lowered my standards the way I had lowered my voice for years. One evening, as I was sorting through paperwork on the coffee table, Mason stopped and picked up a document. "What's this?" he asked. "Bank statements," I replied calmly. Budgeting." He skimmed the page, then frowned. "You should have planned better before leaving Dad," he said. "You didn't think this through." Something inside me tightened. "I thought through surviving," I said quietly. He snorted. "Plenty of people survive unhappy marriages," he replied. "They don't blow everything up." Blow everything up. The phrase echoed. "Mason," I said, choosing my words carefully, "you don't know what it's like to wake up every day feeling smaller." He shook his head. "You always make things dramatic," he said. "Dad wasn't that bad." That was when I realized the truth I had been avoiding. Mason had built his understanding of my marriage on what he needed to believe. Admitting it was harmful would mean admitting he failed to see it. It would mean admitting he benefited from my silence. And that was too uncomfortable for him. A few nights later, I overheard Mason on the phone with his father. Frank's voice was faint but recognizable, sharp even through the speaker. "She is staying with you," Frank said, loud enough that I could hear it from the couch. Mason sighed. "For now." Frank laughed. "See? She always lands on her feet," he said. "You shouldn't enable her. She made her bed." My stomach dropped. Mason didn't defend me. He just said, "Yeah, I know." When the call ended, Mason walked past me without a word, as if nothing had happened. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, and felt something finally crack open. Not my heart. My clarity. I had left one house where my pain was minimized only to enter another where it was judged. The faces were different, but the lesson was the same. Be quieter. Be easier. Take up less space. The next morning, I didn't rush to hide my things. I made coffee and sat at the table while Mason and Kelsey moved around me. Mason looked irritated. "You're in the way," he said. I looked up at him steadily. "I live here right now," I replied. The words surprised both of us. He frowned. "That doesn't mean, it means I exist," I said, my voice calm but firm. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. That afternoon, I went to the library and sat for hours, not looking for apartments, but reading. Reading about emotional abuse. About long-term psychological control. About the patterns of silence and blame. Every page felt like someone describing my life in words I never had. I wasn't weak. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't irresponsible. I had been surviving in a system designed to make me doubt myself. When I returned to the house that evening, Mason was waiting in the living room. "We need to talk," he said. "About what?" I asked. "About you staying here," he replied. "This isn't working." I nodded slowly. "You're right," I said. "It isn't." He blinked, thrown off by my agreement. "So you'll be out soon?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "But not because I failed. Because I choose not to be humiliated." He scoffed. "You overreacting." I met his gaze. "No," I said. "I'm done reacting. I'm deciding." That night, I packed my suitcase again. Not in a rush. Not with shaking hands. With intention. The couch looked smaller than it had when I arrived. Or maybe I had grown. I booked a short-term room near the city center, somewhere modest but mine. When Mason saw my bag by the door the next morning, he looked relieved. "Good," he said. "This is for the best." I nodded. "It is," I replied. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't offer help. He didn't hug me. As I walked out, I felt a familiar ache, but beneath it was something new. Resolve. Because for the first time since my divorce, I understood something clearly. Being given a place does not mean being given dignity. And if comfort requires silence, then maybe discomfort is where truth finally begins. I moved into the small furnished room the same day I left Mason's house. It was nothing special. A narrow bed, a desk by the window, a kitchenette barely big enough to turn around in. But when I closed the door behind me and set my suitcase down, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Safety. No one would tell me to lower my voice. No one would count the hours I existed in their space. No one would remind me that my presence was conditional. That first night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that only comes when your body finally believes it is allowed to rest. The days that followed were quiet. I unpacked slowly, cooked simple meals, and let myself exist without apologizing. I found an apartment within a week, modest but bright, with a small balcony and enough room to breathe. I signed the lease without asking anyone's permission. When Mason found out, he texted a single sentence. "Glad you figured something out." I stared at the message for a long moment, then put my phone down. I did not respond. For the first time, silence was not something done to me. It was something I chose. A month passed. Then another. Mason did not call. I heard through relatives that he and Kelsey were struggling. Money was tighter than expected. Tension grew. The convenient narrative that his mother was irresponsible no longer solved anything. One evening, my phone rang. Mason's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated, then answered. His voice sounded different. Less certain. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" I closed my eyes briefly. "We are talking," I replied. There was a pause. "I didn't realize how hard things were for you," he said carefully, as if testing the words. "Dad's been difficult lately." I said nothing. He continued. "He told me some things about your marriage. About the arguments. About how unhappy you were." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. "And?" I asked. "And I think I underestimated what you went through," he admitted. Underestimated. The word felt small compared to years of dismissal, but it was a crack. "Mason," I said calmly, "this is not about who was worse. It's about the fact that you decided my pain was less important than your comfort." He was quiet. "I know," he said softly. "I was wrong." I believed he meant it this time, but belief does not erase memory. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," I said. "I'm telling you what I need if we're going to have a relationship." He listened. I told him I would not accept being spoken to with contempt. I would not sleep on couches to make others feel superior. I would not be told that dignity was a luxury I forfeited by leaving a harmful marriage. If he wanted me in his life, it would be as a mother, not a burden. He agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly. Healing takes longer than apologies. Weeks later, Mason asked if he could visit. Alone. He arrived with uncertainty written all over him, standing in my small apartment like he didn't know where to put his hands. He looked around, taking in the plants on the balcony, the framed photos, the quiet order. "You seem okay," he said. "I am," I replied. We sat across from each other, not on a couch meant to be temporary, but at a table. He apologized again, this time without justifying himself. He told me he was ashamed of what he said, of how he treated me. I listened. I did not rush to comfort him. I did not minimize my pain to make his easier. And when he asked, "Can you forgive me?" I answered honestly. "I can work toward it," I said. "Forgiveness is not a reset button. It's a process." He nodded, eyes wet. That was the first adult conversation we had ever had. Our relationship did not transform overnight. There were awkward moments. Boundaries tested. Habits unlearned. But I stayed firm. I did not move back. I did not soften my needs to make him comfortable. And slowly, something shifted. He began to see me not as an extension of his past, but as a person with a present. Months later, I ran into Frank at a grocery store. He looked surprised to see me calm, steady, unafraid. He made a comment about me doing better than expected. I smiled politely and walked away. I did not need him to understand. I had already reclaimed what mattered. If you are listening to this story and you are sleeping on someone else's couch, carrying guilt that does not belong to you, hear this clearly. Leaving a harmful situation is not a failure. Being offered help without respect is not kindness. And choosing dignity over comfort is not selfish. It is survival. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're listening from, and whether you've ever had to choose yourself when someone you loved made you feel small. Your story matters, and you are not alone.